Nobody in the operations room that morning could explain why the transponder signal simply stopped. One moment, Flight Ghost 7 was a green diamond blinking steadily across the radar scope at 31,000 feet over the North Arabian Sea. The next moment, nothing. No distress squawk, no mayday call, no debris field reported by any passing vessel. Just a hole in the sky where an aircraft had been, and a silence so total it made the watch officer's coffee go cold before he'd even thought to pick it up. The timestamp read 0447 local. The sea below was ink black, heaving in slow swells under a moonless sky. The duty controller keyed his handset 3 times and received nothing back but static. He looked at his supervisor. His supervisor looked at the board. Then everyone in that room looked at the same empty coordinate, and the unspoken question hung over them like smoke. Who do you send when there is nowhere to send anyone to? The answer, it turned out, had been sitting in a ready room chair at a forward operating base 80 nautical miles to the northwest, eating a cold flatbread and reading a dog-eared copy of Sun Tzu she'd borrowed from the squadron library 4 months ago and never returned. Her flight suit was faded at the elbows. Patch on her left shoulder, a black bird banking hard against a crescent moon, was slightly crooked, the way it always was, because she'd sewn it on herself after the original stitching frayed somewhere over the Hindu Kush. Her name, stenciled on her helmet bag in block letters with a permanent marker that had been running dry, was KOWLCZYK. Major Teodora Kowalczyk, 21 years in uniform, 3 theaters, 1 court of inquiry she didn't start and didn't lose. Call sign Wraith. The men in her squadron called her other things when they thought she couldn't hear. Old Ghost was the polite one. Some said she'd been passed over for lieutenant colonel not once but twice, which was true, and attributed it to temperament, which was not entirely fair, and to a particular incident over the Fergana Valley, which was complicated. She'd stopped correcting the record years ago. Corrections required energy better spent on pre-flight checks and fuel calculations, and the kind of quiet, methodical thinking that keeps a pilot alive when the aircraft decides to stop cooperating at altitude. She had been scheduled for a routine maritime patrol that morning. 4 hours out, 4 hours back, nothing to look at but water and the occasional container ship. She had not been scheduled to become the last known voice in contact with a ghost aircraft. She had not been scheduled to fly into the edge of a geopolitical crisis that 3 governments would spend 18 months trying to officially deny. But the phone on the wall of the ready room rang at 04:53, and Major Teodora Kowalczyk set down her flatbread and her Sun Tzu, and she answered it. The FA-18F she was assigned that morning was tail number 412. A Block II Super Hornet with a repainted radome that always looked slightly too white against the gray of the fuselage, like a bandage that hadn't quite matched the skin tone. The airframe had 3,400 flight hours on it, more than half of them combat logged, and it had the feel of a veteran aircraft, a little stiff on the left aileron in cold air, a fuel flow indicator that read 2% high in the left wing tank, a cockpit smell of old hydraulic fluid, and whatever the last pilot had eaten for lunch. Kowalczyk knew all of this. She had flown 412 times before and maintained her own handwritten notes on its quirks in a small green notebook she kept in her left knee pocket. She walked the plane in the dark, her flashlight sweeping the undercarriage with the deliberate patience of someone who had learned at cost that the tarmac never lies but the maintenance log sometimes does. The ordnance crew had hung a pair of AIM-120s on the wingtip stations, which was standard, and a centerline fuel tank that added range but cost her 12 knots in max sprint speed, which she noted and accepted. The night air smelled of salt and aviation kerosene and the particular mineral odor of a desert coastline at pre-dawn. The stars overhead were extraordinary, the kind of dense and undiluted canopy you only see from military airfields far from city light, and she paused once for just a second, tilting her head back, not to admire them, to orient herself by them the way she always had, even now that the aircraft had 4 independent GPS systems and a moving map display the size of a dinner plate. Her wingman that morning was Lieutenant Pavel Grubik, 26 years old, 18 months out of Meridian, still flying with the slightly aggressive angle of attack that young pilots develop when they want to prove something and haven't yet learned that proving is for peacetime. He was strapping in when she crossed to his jet and rapped twice on the canopy rail. He looked down. She held up 2 fingers, then pointed to her own oxygen connector. He checked his. It wasn't fully seated. He fixed it without a word, and she moved on, and he spent the rest of that morning trying to decide whether she'd saved his life or simply noticed a detail he'd have caught himself. He never quite resolved the question. Ground control cleared them at 0514, and Ghost 7's last known position bore 273 degrees at 812 nautical miles. The math was simple and brutal. They would reach the search area at bingo fuel, maybe a hair past it, with no divert field within reach. Any commander following standard risk protocol would have turned them around. Kowalczyk knew this. She had already calculated it 3 times by hand on the inside cover of the Sun Tzu. She pushed the throttles past military power, and the twin GE engines lit the darkness behind her like small stars. The first hour of the transit was clean and silent, the way long overwater flights tend to be before the world asserts itself. The Super Hornet climbed to 33,000 feet and settled into a cruise that felt almost peaceful if you ignored the numbers scrolling on the fuel gauge and the emptiness on the tactical display where friendly coverage should have been and wasn't. Kowalczyk had her oxygen mask sealed and her visor down against the early sun now cracking the eastern horizon at her 7 o'clock, painting the cockpit interior in a deep amber that made the instruments look like they were made of something warmer than aluminum and glass. She had a habit on long transits of counting, not seconds or miles but variables. Things known, things assumed, things unknown. It was a framework she'd learned not from any syllabus but from a WSO named Barbo she'd flown with in her second deployment, a quiet man from Manitoba who'd had the rare gift of being genuinely useful at altitude. He had been killed in a ramp strike in the Gulf of Oman in 2011, and she had delivered his personal effects to his mother in a rental car outside Winnipeg in February in 3 feet of snow, and the woman had made her tea and asked no questions and wept very softly into a dish towel, and Kowalczyk had driven back to the airport thinking about variables. Things known, things assumed, things unknown. What she knew at 0600 hours, Ghost 7 had been a maritime surveillance aircraft, a P-8A Poseidon from the Naval Air Station at Sigonella with a crew of 9. It had been operating under an intelligence collection tasking she had no clearance to know the specifics of, which was fine because specifics weren't what she needed right now. What she needed was its last telemetry vector, which she had, and the drift modeling for an aircraft-sized debris field in a 3-knot current, which she had run in her head using the oceanography brief from 2 days ago that she'd read once and retained completely, because that was one of the things she did. What she assumed, the aircraft had not self-destructed. The crew had not elected to vanish. Something had gone wrong, mechanically or externally, in a space of time so short that no one had reached the radio. What she did not know, whether anyone on that crew was still alive, whether anything that had reached out and silenced Ghost 7 was still in the vicinity, whether she was flying toward a rescue or a recovery or something else entirely, something that did not yet have a clean name in the operational lexicon. Grubik checked in on the aux frequency. Wraith Anvil, you want me on your left or right? Left, she said, don't crowd me. Copy left, a pause, this is a long way to go for nothing. She didn't answer him, she was counting. The search area was a rough octagon drawn on her moving map in dashed yellow lines, updated by fleet operations 20 minutes into the flight when new satellite pass data came in and shifted the probability zone 12 miles south-southwest. Kowalczyk had adjusted her course before the update was officially transmitted to her, which the controller noted in the log and later described to investigators as either prescient or lucky, depending on which report you read. The sea beneath them, at low altitude, was a palette of dark greens and deep navy, the surface texture visible now as low morning light raked across it at a shallow angle. She descended through 8,000 feet and felt the aircraft begin to talk differently in the thicker air, the left aileron doing its usual stiff thing, the whole airframe developing a personality that was different from the clean abstraction of altitude. She liked this. She had always preferred the lower altitudes, where physics became tactile and the relationship between pilot and machine was less theoretical. She found the first piece of Ghost 7 at 07:22. It was not what she expected. There was no debris field in the classic sense, no scattered wreckage radiating outward from a central impact point. What she found instead was a single-life raft, orange inflated standard Navy issue, drifting alone on a glassy patch of sea between 2 slow swells. No one was in it, but it had been deployed, which meant someone had been alive and thinking when they deployed it. That distinction mattered enormously. She circled it twice, photographing with the targeting pod on her centerline station, the sensor giving her crisp imagery she could barely afford time to look at because she was also watching the fuel gauge and the horizon and the tactical display and running probability trees in her head, with the focused quiet of someone who has done this long enough to do several things at once without appearing to do anything at all. Anvil Wraith, I have a deployed raft at coordinates Bravo 79er. No personnel observed, no debris, transmitting imagery now. Copy Wraith, Grubik's voice was tighter now. That thing looks intact. It is intact. So they weren't in it when it went down. No, they weren't. Another silence. The raft turned slowly in a current, its orange a gaudy and defiant color against all that blue-gray water. Kowalczyk stared at it, committing its drift direction to memory, and felt the particular feeling she had learned to recognize over 2 decades. Not dread, not excitement, but the quiet, clarifying weight of a situation that has decided to be serious. She keyed the fleet frequency. Hammer control Wraith, I have a survivor indicator at the following position. You need to wake up anyone who is still asleep. The Fleet Operations Center at Bahrain had been awake since 0449, but it had been awake in the way that institutions are awake when they do not yet understand what they are awake for: alert, busy, moving paper, doing the procedural things that bureaucracies do when confronted with ambiguity. The moment Kowalczyk's transmission came through, the quality of wakefulness changed. Officers stopped shuffling folders. The watch commander, a captain named Oluwatobi Asante, stood up from his chair and did not sit down again for 11 hours. Asante knew Kowalczyk, not well but enough. He had reviewed her jacket once during a force structure review, and what he had come away with was the same thing most people came away with when they actually looked at the record rather than the reputation. The woman was extraordinary, and the Air Wing had managed her the way organizations sometimes manage extraordinary people who don't perform their extraordinariness in visible, promotable ways, by placing her in roles where she could not embarrass anyone by being wrong and could not threaten anyone by being right. He picked up the secure handset. Wraith, this is Hammer Actual. Confirm your fuel state and intended search pattern. She gave him both. The fuel state made him close his eyes briefly. The search pattern she described was not standard. It was not any pattern he recognized from the SAR manuals. It was something she had clearly designed herself in her head based on the raft's drift and the current data and some calculus he could not quite follow but had the feeling she had performed correctly. Wraith, Hammer Actual, SAR helicopter is 40 minutes out from the bunker hill. Can you hold? Negative, not at current fuel. I can give you 22 minutes, then I have to climb and transmit a beacon and start swimming home. The way she said it, flat, dry, the kind of humor that isn't quite humor, made Asante's lip twitch despite himself. He looked at the plot on his screen, the raft position, the helicopter's vector, the asset he had in the search zone, which was one slightly coffee-deprived major in a jet that was slowly becoming a glider. Copy 22 minutes, find me something good, Wraith. That's the plan, Hammer. She dropped to 1,500 feet and began the pattern. What she found over the next 19 minutes was not one thing but several, and each one told a piece of a story that she was assembling in real time with the methodical attention of someone building a clock from scattered parts. The second raft was 3.5 miles northeast of the first, which told her the crew had split their egress, which told her the aircraft had not gone down in a single catastrophic event but had given the crew time, or at least some of the crew time. A survival radio signal, weak and intermittent, pulsed from a position between the two rafts, which told her someone was conscious and operating equipment, which narrowed the survivor probability from theoretical to near certain. The fourth piece was the hardest to process. It was a section of fuselage skin, maybe 4 feet by 6, floating low in the water, still wearing its gray paint and the partial stencil of a bureau number she recognized. The P-8 that had flown that night had not simply malfunctioned. The structural damage she was looking at, even from 1,500 feet, was not consistent with a bird strike or a decompression event, or any of the comfortable mechanical explanations. Something had intersected with Ghost 7 at high energy. The torn metal edges told you that, if you knew how to read torn metal, and Kowalczyk had been reading it for long enough. She did not transmit her assessment immediately. She flew past the debris piece twice more, the targeting pod recording, her face behind the oxygen mask unreadable. Then she climbed to 5,000 feet, shifted to the secure fleet frequency, and said quietly and precisely 9 words that would trigger a cascade of decisions at 3 different fleet commands, and eventually reach 2 national security councils before the sun was fully up. Hammer Actual, Wraith, Ghost 7 was hit. This is a shoot-down. The silence on the frequency lasted 4 seconds. She counted them. Then Asante's voice, stripped of everything except professionalism. Wraith, confirm your assessment. Confirmed, transmitting imagery on Alpha Channel. You'll want to scramble everything you have. Another silence, shorter this time. When Asante came back, his voice had taken on the particular quality of a man who has just understood that the world has changed. Wraith, the survivors, can you localize? I have a signal bearing northwest quadrant of the search zone, but Hammer, you need to know whatever did this may still be in the area. I am currently the only fixed-wing asset within reaction range. She said the last sentence not as a complaint and not as a boast. She said it the way an engineer states a load-bearing calculation. Here is the fact, here is what it means, here is what we do with it. Asante stared at his screen, then he said the thing that needed to be said. Wraith, you are weapons free, defensive only, protect the survivors. She was already turning toward the signal bearing when he said it. The signal was coming from a man named Petty Officer 2nd Class Darius Okafor, who had deployed his personal survival radio 47 minutes after entering the water and had been operating it in 15-second bursts ever since to conserve the battery, which was exactly what the training said to do, and Okafor was, by all subsequent accounts, an exceptionally well-trained sailor who had spent much of those 47 minutes keeping 2 of his crewmates alive through a combination of physical support and an uninterrupted monologue about a fishing trip he had taken as a boy in Cross River State that he later said he told them purely to keep them awake, but which a flight surgeon who interviewed him afterwards said was one of the most effective improvised psychological interventions he had heard documented in a survival scenario. Kowalczyk didn't know any of this yet. What she had was a bearing and a signal strength and the knowledge that every minute she spent low was a minute the fuel gauge moved toward a number she didn't want to reach. She pushed the nose down to 800 feet, which was uncomfortable in the current visibility in sea state, and she widened her search legs by a half-mile because the signal was bouncing off the wave faces and the bearing was intermittently unreliable, and she found the group exactly where the drift math said they would be if they'd been in the water since approximately 0450, which confirmed her timeline. 3 orange survival suits among the swells, 3 people. She could see them from altitude only because of the suits, and because one of them was waving both arms in the universal and desperate language of survival, and she rocked her wings twice in the universal and equally desperate language of I see you. She then did something that was not in the SAR manual. She descended to 400 feet, which was below the floor for single-seat supersonic aircraft in Sea State 3, and flew a slow, deliberate orbit around the 3 survivors at a bank angle that kept them in her visual scan at all times, throttle back to minimum clean speed, aircraft on the ragged edge of comfortable. Because she had decided that no one who had survived being shot down over the Arabian Sea in the dark was going to sink in the next 31 minutes while she was still overhead with fuel in the tanks. Grubik, watching from altitude, said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, Wraith, that's below the deck. I know, she said. You could lose it in a wave contact. I know. Another silence. She kept orbiting. The survivors kept their faces up. You're not going to leave them, he said. It was not a question. No, she said, I'm not. The helicopter arrived at 0804, which was 6 minutes before Kowalczyk's fuel state would have forced her to break off and climb to transmit altitude. She watched the HH-60 from above with the focused attention of a person who has just realized how close the margin was, and is processing that information in a way that looks, to an outside observer, like calm. The rescue swimmer went in on the first drop. 2 of the 3 survivors were recovered in under 8 minutes. The third, Okafor, still transmitting on his survival radio even as the rescue basket descended toward him, was the last out, and he reportedly paused before boarding the basket to look up at the circling jet and raise one hand. She rocked the wings again. Then she climbed to altitude, reset the fuel management system to maximum conservation, and began the long transit home with a fuel state that made Grubik, in his position off her left wing, very quiet for the first 100 miles. Wraith, his voice was careful, how are your numbers? Better than they were. That's not an answer. I'll make it, she said, do the math yourself if you want. He did, then he was quiet for another 50 miles. When he spoke again, his tone had changed in a way that was small but unmistakable, a recalibration, the kind that happens when a young pilot realizes that a colleague they had categorized in a particular way is actually in a different category entirely. Wraith, that descent to 400 feet. What about it? You knew the exact number, didn't you? The minimum you could go and still maintain control margin in that sea state. She said nothing. You calculated it before you did it. I've been flying that jet for 11 years, she said. You learn what it can carry. Grubik turned this over in his head for the rest of the transit. He landed 4 minutes after her, shut down his engines, and sat in the cockpit for a while before climbing out. The deck crew, waiting to chain the jets, noticed he was working something through, the way young officers sometimes look when they've had an experience the training didn't quite prepare them for. She was already in debrief when he got inside. He could see her through the glass partition of the intel office, sitting at the table with a coffee she wasn't drinking, talking through the fuselage debris imagery with 2 analysts who kept nodding and looking at each other with the wide-eyed expression of people absorbing information that is going to change their afternoon significantly. He stood at the glass for a moment, then he went to change out of his flight suit. The debrief lasted 3 hours, which was long even by the standards of a complex flight. Kowalczyk walked the two intelligence analysts through every piece of imagery in sequence, narrating with the unhurried precision of someone who has already written the complete story in her head and is now reading it aloud for an audience. She had noted the angle of the debris edges. She had noted the paint-scorch pattern on the fuselage skin, which told her something about heat exposure and entry angle that the analysts needed her to explain twice before they got it. She had noted the drift differential between the two rafts, which gave a rough ejection timeline, which in turn suggested the crew had known impact was coming and had initiated egress procedures before the aircraft was structurally uncontrollable. That last detail was important. It meant the crew had experienced some kind of warning, a missile track, a system alert, something before the terminal event. It meant there was a sequence, and sequences could be reconstructed, and reconstructed sequences had implications for where the missile had come from and who had fired it and why. She set her coffee down and looked at the lead analyst, a young civilian named Marchetti who wore rectangular glasses and had the slightly caffeinated intensity of someone who had come to the government from an academic background and still found classified material genuinely exciting rather than merely routine. The scorch angle, Kowalczyk said, it's consistent with an infrared-guided weapon fired from below and behind, probably a man-portable system. The kill chain on that requires a waterborne platform within approximately 4 nautical miles of the intercept point. Marchetti was writing quickly. We'll need to correlate with any AIS contacts in the area. There were none on the commercial AIS layer at the time of loss. That's in the operations log. Right, but a non-broadcasting platform would have been within radar coverage of 2 surveillance assets and a destroyer. The ship tracks for the period are in the system. You'll need to look at the radar sidelobe data from the Momsen, not the primary sweep. She paused. It'll be there. Look at the 43-minute window before the loss. Marchetti stared at her. How do you? Because it's the only geometry that works, she said, and because I've seen it before. She didn't say where. She picked up the coffee, finally drank it, and waited for them to understand what they were looking at. Momsen's radar data confirmed it within 4 hours. There had been a contact small-low, moving at approximately 13 knots on a heading that placed it within 3.8 nautical miles of Ghost 7's last known position at the time of the loss. The contact had appeared on the sidelobe data, which was not the data anyone routinely reviewed because sidelobe processing required an additional computational step that was theoretically automated and practically ignored. A small vessel. No AIS. No IFF squawk, gone from the radar plot by 0510. Fleet operations briefed the finding up the chain with the careful hedge-everything language that flag officers use when they are presenting information that could start something. The words attributed and likely and consistent with appeared many times. The single piece of analysis that did not hedge was Major Kowalczyk's on-scene assessment, which had been transmitted at 0721 and said, "This is a shoot-down. 4 words, no hedging." By noon, that assessment was sitting in front of 3 separate national security staff officers in 2 countries. By 1430, there were follow-on assets tasked to the search area with a new primary objective. By 1700, a diplomatic channel had been activated that Kowalczyk would never be informed of, because the event she had identified and correctly characterized had become, in the terminology of these things, a matter at a level above her clearance. What she was informed of, at 1645, as she was writing her own after-action report in longhand at the debriefing table, was that all 3 recovered survivors were in stable condition aboard the Bunker Hill. That Petty Officer Acaffer had required no medical treatment beyond rehydration. That the 2 other survivors, a lieutenant commander and a petty officer first class, had hypothermia and 1 fractured wrist between them. 9 crew, 3 survivors, 6 unaccounted for. She set her pen down and looked at the bulkhead for a while. Then she picked up the pen and kept writing because the report would be read by people who needed to understand exactly what had happened out there, and the only way they would understand it was if she wrote it with the same accuracy she brought to everything else, even the parts that were hard. Especially the parts that were hard. The after-action report filed by Major Teodor Kowalczyk ran to 31 pages, not counting the appendices. It was dense, technical, and written with an unusual absence of passive voice, which made it read, in the words of one flag-level officer who reviewed it, like something between a technical monograph and a legal brief, which was not the standard format but was, he acknowledged, exactly what the situation required. Every calculation she had performed in the air was reproduced in the appendices, with the inputs and the methodology and the conclusions, so that any reader with the background to check the math could do so, and every reader who had done so had reached the same conclusions she had. The report's formal classification precluded its distribution to anyone outside the operational chain, which meant it went to the air wing, to fleet operations, to the appropriate intelligence commands, and to a small office in the Pentagon whose name she didn't know, and whose acknowledgement of receipt was a single line in an automated system that just said received with thanks. That was fine. She had not written it to be read in the way that people write reports in the hope of being read. She had written it because a complete, accurate account of what had happened needed to exist somewhere in permanent form so that the people who came after would understand what had been done and how. What she did not write in any appendix or any section was the thing she had felt in the cockpit at 0722 when she found the raft. She was not in the habit of writing those things. They lived where they lived in the particular texture of that 47-minute descent, in the memory of 3 orange suits among gray swells, in the rocked wings, and the hand raised from a rescue basket over the North Arabian Sea. She submitted the report at 19:30 and walked to the squadron's outdoor smoking area, which she had used as a standing area since she had stopped smoking 6 years ago. She stood there in the cooling air, looking up at a sky that was moving rapidly through indigo toward full dark, and she thought about Barbo the way she sometimes did at the end of a serious day. She wondered what he would have said about the sidelobe data. He had been excellent at radar theory. Probably he would have found it in 2 hours instead of 4. She went to the mess, ate alone, and slept without difficulty. The first call she did not expect came at 09:15 the following morning, patched through the squadron's secure voice circuit from Bahrain. It was Captain Assant. He said, "I've read your report." She said, "Okay." He said, "All of it." "I know," she said, "it's long. The fuel calculation in Appendix C." "What about it?" "You flew the last 22 minutes of that search on a fuel state that I don't think I have the authority to have approved." She was quiet for a moment. "You didn't approve it, I was already there." "I know." Another pause. "What I want to know is, and you don't have to answer this, was there any point during those 22 minutes where you thought you might not make it back?" She thought about it honestly, which she always did, even when honesty was inconvenient. "There was a 6-minute window," she said, "between when I found the 3rd survivor and when the helicopter arrived, where the math was not comfortable." Comfortable. It was within limits, technically. The margin was approximately 4% below what I would have briefed as a planning minimum. "But you stayed." "I had 3 people in the water and no one else overhead." Assant was quiet for a long moment. She could hear faintly the background noise of the operations center, a hum of equipment, a distant radio voice. "Major," he said finally, "I put you in for something. I want you to know before you hear it through other channels." She said nothing. She had been in for things before. Things had a way of becoming complicated when they involved her name. "It's a DFC," he said, "Distinguished Flying Cross, for the search and for the shoot-down characterization, both." She sat with that for a moment. She was aware, in the way she was always aware of institutional ironies, that this was the same air wing that had passed her over for command twice in 6 years. She chose not to say that. Instead she said, "How are the survivors?" "The lieutenant commander was discharged from medical this morning. Akafar's flying home tonight." "Good," she said, and meant it completely. The Distinguished Flying Cross citation was read at a brief ceremony on the flight deck of the carrier 11 days later, in the particular bureaucratic sunshine of a clear Gulf morning, with a moderate breeze coming off the water that made the flags pop and caused the reading officer to grip the papers firmly. Kowalczyk stood in her service dress with her hands at her sides, the crooked patch on her left shoulder corrected for the occasion by someone who had taken it upon themselves to restitch it without telling her, a gesture she noticed and said nothing about. The Air Wing commander, a 2-star she had known peripherally for years and never had occasion to interact with directly, pinned the medal with the careful, practiced motion of someone who has done this enough times to do it quickly. He then shook her hand, held it for a moment longer than the protocol strictly required, and said something quietly that no one else on the flight deck heard. What he said was, "I've looked at the full record now, all of it. I should have looked at it sooner." She met his eyes. He was a big man who carried his rank with the comfortable ease of someone who had never seriously questioned whether he belonged in it, and she recognized that quality because it was one she had never had the luxury of. She said, "Thank you for the ceremony, Admiral." He nodded, stepped back. The ceremony moved on to other matters. Grubik was standing in the second row and she saw him when she turned from the podium. He had the expression of a young officer who is revising something, a category, an assumption, a way of seeing a thing, and finding that the revision is not comfortable but is necessary. She gave him the smallest nod. He returned it. The ceremony lasted another 12 minutes. She stood through the rest of it in the bright morning, with the Gulf of Oman visible beyond the ship's bow and the sky overhead the particular empty blue of deep water reflected upward, and she thought of Barbo again briefly, and then she stopped thinking about anything in particular and just stood in the sun. The 6 crew members who did not survive were found over the following 9 days, recovered by a combination of surface assets and search aircraft operating on updated drift models that were refined using Kowalczyk's original probability calculations as a baseline. The findings were not public. The families were notified through channels that moved with a slowness that seemed impossible to endure, and was nonetheless endured. She wrote letters to each of the 6 families. This was not required of her and was not expected. She had never met any of the 6 crew members and had not been assigned to their unit. She wrote the letters anyway, one at a time, in the evenings over the course of a week, on plain writing paper she'd bought at the Naval Exchange. Each letter described what she had observed from the air, the life raft deployed, the deliberate survival actions, the evidence that the crew had responded with professionalism and courage in their final minutes. She did not use the word heroic, which she had always found to be a word that people applied to things they didn't want to look at directly. She used words like deliberate and skilled and prepared. She did not know if the letters helped. She sent them because not sending them felt wrong, and because the record of what those 6 people had done, the training that had caused them to deploy the rafts, to split the egress, to help each other, deserved to exist somewhere outside of classified files. One of the families wrote back. A woman from Galveston, the mother of a petty officer 2nd class who had been 24 years old and had apparently been the one to deploy the 2nd raft, a detail Kowalczyk had included because the drift modeling confirmed it. The mother's letter was 3 paragraphs, handwritten on stationery with small flowers in the corners. The last paragraph said, knowing he kept doing his job until the end, knowing he had training and he used it, that is the thing I hold on to. Kowalczyk read that paragraph several times. She folded the letter and kept it in her flight suit pocket for the remainder of the deployment, inside the left knee pocket with the green notebook of aircraft notes. The entity responsible for the shootdown was identified through a combination of the radar analysis, signal intelligence, and the work of 3 allied intelligence services over the following 6 weeks. The details of that identification are, and will likely remain, classified at a level that precludes their public discussion. What can be said is that the small vessel on the Momsen's sidelobe data was eventually traced to a specific actor, and that the diplomatic and operational responses to that identification were significant, and that the incident became one of those events that reshapes certain threat assessments in ways that reverberate through planning documents for years. None of that reverberation was publicly attributed to Kowalczyk, because none of it could be. The chain of causation that ran from her forward transmission at 0721, this is a shootdown to the policy responses that followed, was real but invisible, buried under classification and institutional language, and the way that large organizations absorb individual contributions into collective outcomes. In the aviation community, though in the specific small world of naval aviation, where people talk to each other at wings and squadrons and in the ready rooms of deployments, the word moved differently. Not officially, but the way words move when something real has happened and the people who were present cannot quite stop thinking about it. Rubik told his next squadron. The analysts Marchetti consulted told colleagues in the intelligence community. Assant, in a characteristically understated way, made sure that certain flag officers who reviewed certain promotion files were aware of what the full record contained. She was selected for lieutenant colonel 8 months later on the first board after the incident. The selection board's comments were not shared with her, but they were shared with her wing commander, and they used language that, in the careful institutional vocabulary of promotion boards, amounted to a frank acknowledgement that something should have happened sooner. She received the notice while eating breakfast alone in the mess, read it twice, finished her eggs, and went to do her pre-flight inspection. She took command of her own squadron 14 months after the incident. It was a training command, which was not what she might have wanted, and which she accepted with the private recognition that 14 months ago she had not expected to command anything, and a training command was still a command, and commands were where the future was made. The squadron flew T-45 Goshawks, the 2-seat jet trainer the Navy used to produce its carrier pilots, and her primary job was to oversee the instruction of the next generation of people who would one day be faced with decisions in aircraft over open water with no one else in range. She redesigned the emergency fuel management curriculum in her first 60 days. Not dramatically, she didn't announce it as a redesign, just quietly updated the training scenarios to include cases where the calculation was tighter than the planning minimum and the stakes required you to commit anyway. She also added a module on debris interpretation that did not exist in the standard syllabus and that she wrote herself at the table in her office, using the same methodology she had used in the debrief with Marchetti. She sourced the imagery examples from the classified archive and got the required clearance approvals through channels, which took 2 months and involved a great deal of paperwork that she completed without complaint. The instructors under her command were mostly lieutenants and lieutenant commanders, the majority of them male, the majority of them aware of who she was and uncertain how to hold that awareness. She dealt with this the way she dealt with most things, by being exactly what she was, consistently and without performance, and waiting for the uncertainty to resolve itself into something more useful. It took on average about 6 weeks per person. The first time one of her instructors came to her office with a fuel management question that went beyond the syllabus, genuinely beyond it, a real scenario from a real flight where the math had been uncomfortable, she answered it completely and then asked him to write up his own analysis and bring it back so they could compare the approaches. He came back the next day. Their analyses agreed on the conclusion and differed on the method, and the conversation that followed was 40 minutes long and was one of the better conversations she had in the command tour. He told her at the end of it, "I didn't know you thought about it this way." She looked at him for a moment. "How did you think I thought about it?" He didn't have an answer. She nodded, which was as close as she came to making the point explicitly, and moved on. The students were harder. Not because they were difficult, most of them were genuinely trying, in the intense and slightly desperate way of people who have gotten within reach of something they've wanted for a long time and are afraid to lose it now. They were harder because they were at the stage of their development where they were still constructing their identities as pilots, and the person standing in front of them was not the identity they had imagined constructing, and that created a kind of cognitive friction that she had to account for in how she taught. She did not lecture on herself. She never used her own experience as a primary text in the classroom, which was a restraint that some instructors found puzzling and which she maintained for a reason. The students needed to develop their own models, and if she handed them hers, they would borrow it rather than build, and borrowing was not the same thing. What she did instead was use the kinds of problems she had solved, not as biography but as category, and let the students work through them, and watch what they did, and intervene with precision when they reached for the wrong answer. There was a student in the second class of her command tour whose name was Ensign Matthias Brando, who was excellent in the air and resistant on the ground, the specific resistance of someone who was used to being the best in the room, and was encountering for the first time an evaluator who was not impressed by excellent in the usual way. He flew precise formations and hit every checkpoint, and made the carrier approaches with a confidence that the other students watched with something close to envy. He also, in the debriefs, had a habit of justifying his decisions after the fact in ways that smoothed over the moments when he had actually been guessing. Howalczyk noticed this in the second debrief and said nothing about it in the third or the fourth. She waited. On the fifth debrief, she asked him to reconstruct his fuel management decision at the 40-minute mark of the training flight. He did so smoothly. She asked him what his bingo state had been at that exact moment. He gave a number. She put his own IFDS download on the screen, the actual number from the actual aircraft, and it was 18% higher than what he'd said. The room was very quiet. He looked at the screen for a moment. "The point," she said to the whole room, "is not the error. The point is what happens in the air when you believe your own reconstruction. You build your next decision on a number that isn't real, and at 800 miles from any runway, a number that isn't real is the thing that kills you." Nobody in the room said anything. Brando looked at his hands and then at the screen and then at her. "How do you keep the numbers accurate," he said, "when everything else is moving?" "You practice keeping them accurate when nothing is moving," she said, "so it's a habit." She kept the green notebook. It moved with her from the Super Hornet to the desk in her office at the training command, and eventually to the office she occupied as a deputy wing commander, where it sat in the top right drawer next to a mechanical pencil and the handwritten letter from the mother in Galveston. The notebook was nearly full by then, 9 years of aircraft notes, the idiosyncratic behaviors of specific tail numbers, the small technical deviations that no one else thought to record because they were minor, and because no one else was paying that kind of attention. She never flew tail 412 again after the Arabian Sea flight. It was transferred to another wing 6 months after the incident, and she heard, third-hand, that it had been retired from service 2 years later with a total airframe life of 4,100 hours. She thought about that for a moment when she heard it and then didn't think about it again for a long time. What she thought about, more regularly than any specific aircraft, was the problem of communication. Not the radio kind, she had no anxieties there, but the institutional kind, the way that information about what people could actually do was consistently degraded as it moved up the chain of command, until the person making the decisions was working from a facsimile rather than the original. She had been a victim of this process and had spent 23 years watching others be victims of it, and the only antidote she'd found was the same antidote she brought to everything. Be accurate, be consistent, be visible in the ways that matter and invisible in the ways that don't, and eventually the record would speak for itself. The record had eventually spoken for itself. She was aware that this was not a universal outcome. She had known pilots whose records never got read and whose careers ended at the wrong altitude. She held that knowledge carefully as a kind of ballast so that her own elevation didn't become the thing she was working toward, but rather a platform for work that was larger than elevation. The training command produced 63 carrier-qualified pilots during her tenure. Of those, 41 were still flying when she retired. 4 of them later commanded squadrons of their own. One of them was Branda, who had become, against everyone's initial expectations including his own, a genuinely excellent officer and a patient, exacting instructor in his own right. He sent her a brief message when she retired that said only, "I kept the numbers accurate." She replied with 2 words, "Good habit." The retirement ceremony was in Pensacola on a Friday in October, which meant the sky had the particular quality it gets in the Florida Panhandle in fall, high and clear and intensely blue, with a brightness that made everything look slightly more itself than usual. She wore her service dress with every ribbon and device she had accumulated over 24 years, which was a considerable number, and the medals on her chest included the Distinguished Flying Cross in the 2nd position from the top, as protocol required. The ceremony followed the standard format which she had watched performed for other officers many times and had never quite known how to feel about. There was the reading of the orders, the playing of the national anthem, the retirement of the colors. The remarks by the presiding officer, which were formal and accurate and which described her career in the way that official remarks describe careers, chronologically, with the major assignments and the decorations and a carefully chosen anecdote, in this case the Arabian Sea recovery, which was not classified at the summary level and had been approved for mention. What the remarks did not mention, because they couldn't, was the letter from Galveston, or the green notebook, or the fuel calculation in Appendix C, the 6-minute window where the math was not comfortable but she had stayed anyway because there was no one else overhead, or Barbo, who had taught her to count variables in a cockpit over the North Indian Ocean when she was 27 years old, and who had never made it to his own retirement ceremony. After the formal portion, they let her speak. She had written a few notes on a card which she looked at once and then set down. She said that the work of aviation was fundamentally about the relationship between precision and uncertainty, that every flight was an argument you were making continuously, that the known was sufficient to manage the unknown, that the argument was never definitively won, which was why you never stopped making it. That the people she had flown with had taught her this not by explaining it but by demonstrating it, by showing up at the aircraft with the same level of attention on the 200th flight as on the first. She thanked a Sant who was not in the room but to whom she owed a specific debt she wanted on the record. She thanked the 3 survivors of Ghost 7, 2 of whom were in the audience, because they had kept doing their jobs even when the aircraft was no longer around them, which was the purest expression of training she had ever witnessed. She did not thank the air wing for the promotions that had finally come. She had been in this room long enough to know that institutional grace, when it arrives late, is still grace, and you receive it without resentment, but you also don't mistake it for something that was owed. She finished speaking, the audience applauded. The sky outside the windows of the ceremony hall remained exactly as blue as it had been. There is a practice in naval aviation of keeping what are called cruise books, a photographic and written record of a deployment, produced by the unit and distributed to its members. They are informal documents, more scrapbook than history, and they tend to capture the social fabric of a deployment more than its operational content. Kowalczyk appeared in the cruise books of 7 deployments. In the early ones, she appeared at the margins, a figure in the background of a flight deck photograph, a name in a crew manifest. In the later ones, she appeared where she actually was, which was central, though she was not the kind of person who sought the center of photographs. After her retirement, a collection of her training materials was compiled by the Naval Aviation School's command and incorporated into the curriculum for advanced instrument and overwater instruction. The compilation was not attributed to her by name in the training materials, because that was not how the curriculum system worked, but the instructors who used it knew where it had come from, and they told their students informally in the ready room conversations that carry information that formal documents don't. One of those conversations, 3 years after her retirement, was overheard by a student who later became an instructor, who later became the subject of a podcast about naval aviation history that aired to a small but attentive audience. The story was not detailed. The student had caught only the outline of it: a flight over the Arabian Sea, a fuel state that was tight, a decision to stay over 3 survivors, but the outline was accurate, and the podcast's audience, which included people who had been there, confirmed the details in the comment section with the careful specificity of people who know a story and want to make sure it's told correctly. None of this constituted fame. None of it was the kind of recognition that resolves into a biography or a documentary or a name on a building. It was the smaller and in some ways more durable kind of recognition, the kind that lives in practice in the way a calculation is taught, in the moment when an instructor tells a student about a pilot who stayed at 400 feet in sea state 3, because there was no one else overhead and the math, while not comfortable, was within limits. Kowalczyk, who was by this point living in a house outside of Pensacola with a vegetable garden that required the same kind of patient, methodical attention she had given to everything else, was not aware of the podcast. She had not been tracking what was said about her. She was tracking the weather patterns that affected her growing season and the fuel prices that affected the small civilian aircraft she was now flying for pleasure, and the technical manuals for the Cirrus SR-22 she had purchased, which had its own quirks, less interesting than 412's but present nonetheless. She had started a new notebook. The 3 survivors of Ghost 7 maintained contact with each other in the loose, intermittent way of people who have shared something extreme and emerged from it into normal lives that can never quite be fully explained by reference to the normal. Achafer was teaching at the Navy's survival school in Pensacola, which was how he had ended up in the same city as Kowalczyk without either of them initially knowing it. They met at a commissary 9 years after the Arabian Sea in the parking lot, where he recognized the faded patch on her jacket, the black bird against the crescent moon, still slightly crooked before he recognized her face. He said, "Wraith." She turned and looked at him. A long moment passed. She said, "Petty Officer Achafer." He was a chief petty officer by then, the crow on his sleeve dark with years of service, his face older and more settled than it had been in the survival imagery she had studied in the debrief. He looked at her with the direct, serious attention of someone who has a great deal to say and is uncertain where to start. He started with, "I counted your passes while I was in the water." "How many?" she said. 14 over 47 minutes, and then you rocked the wings. "I saw you waving." "I was waving to stay warm," he said, "but also for the other reason." She nodded, he nodded. A car pulled out of the lot between them and they waited for it. He said, "I've told the story a lot in the school when we talk about survival psychology, about what it means to know that someone is overhead." She said nothing. "I always describe the wings, the rocking, because the people I'm teaching are going to be in the water someday, some of them, and I want them to know that it can happen that way, that someone can find you when it doesn't look findable." She looked at him for a long moment. He was looking at her with the expression she had seen before, the expression that happened when people who had been through something serious encountered the person on the other end of it and found the distance between them smaller than expected. She said, "You kept the radio running, that's how I found you." "The training," he said. "Yes," she said, "the training." They stood in the parking lot in the October sunshine for another moment. Then she said she had to get her groceries cold, and he said he had a class in the afternoon, and they exchanged the small practical information of people who now lived in the same city and would likely see each other again. As he walked away, he turned once. "Wraith," he said, "thank you." She lifted one hand briefly and went to her car. The sky over Pensacola in October does something specific in the late afternoon. The light comes in at a low angle from the southwest, across the Gulf, and it catches the bottom of the clouds, the scattered cumulus that build over the warm water and drift inland, and turns them amber and rose from underneath, while the tops stay white and the blue above them deepens toward indigo. It is the kind of sky that pilots know and civilians sometimes stop on sidewalks to look at. It is the kind of sky that means different things depending on where you are in your relationship to it. Kowalczyk drove home from the commissary in the late afternoon light with the groceries in the back and the radio off, because she preferred the sound of the road. She took the long way, the route that went past the perimeter of the NAS and along the approach path for Runway 7, where you could, if you timed it right, see the T-45s coming in for the field carrier landing practice. The student pilots running the pattern in the low golden light, establishing their glide paths, making the calculations that they had been taught to make, arguing continuously with the known and the unknown. She pulled over once and watched 3 circuits. The first aircraft was a little high on the approach and corrected early, which was the right instinct. The second was exactly where it should be, all the way down, steady and precise, a nice piece of flying. The third was a student she didn't recognize, and the approach was slightly low initially, which tightened and then steadied, and then the aircraft crossed the threshold right on numbers. She watched them taxi clear. Then she sat in the car for a moment with her hands on the wheel, looking at the sky that was now fully amber, the blue nearly gone, and she thought briefly, without drama, about all the hours she had spent in that element, all the specific calculations, all the exact fuel states. All the moments where the math was tight and the decision was clear, and she had made it, each time with the quiet certainty of someone who has done the preparation and trusts what the preparation is worth. 24 years, more than 8,000 flight hours, the Gulf of Oman at 400 feet in Sea State 3. The wings rocked twice above 3 orange suits in gray water. She put the car in drive. What remains of a career like hers is not the official record, though the official record is real, and the citations are accurate, and the papers are filed in the archives where they will be retrievable for as long as the archives endure. What remains is something more distributed and less legible than a file. It is in the curriculum she revised and the graduates who fly from it. It is in Akafer's classroom, in the way he describes the wings rocking, in the understanding he plants in students who will be alone in the water someday and need to know that search is possible even when it doesn't look possible. It is in the conversation Brandau carries into his own debriefs, the pause before the IFDS download, the question, what was the actual number? It is in the notebook, a new one now, spiral-bound, olive green, with Cirrus SR-22 written on the cover in permanent marker over KOWALCZYK in block letters, which she keeps in the left pocket of whatever jacket she is wearing, because that is where it has always gone, and the habit is older now than most of the people she teaches. It is in the quality of a certain kind of attention, the kind that sees the debris angle and reads the heat scorch and calculates the drift, the kind that stays at 400 feet when the math is uncomfortable because the 3 people below you are still in the water and there is no one else overhead, and you have done the preparation and you trust what the preparation is worth. Institutions do not always know how to hold this kind of thing. They know how to hold records and citations in the language of promotion boards. The other kind of knowing, the transmission from one person to another of what it actually means to be in the air when it matters, moves through different channels. Ready room conversations, letters on plain writing paper, the way a wing is rocked above a rescue basket. The way a call sign becomes, over time and without anyone deciding it, a kind of shorthand for a quality that the lexicon has difficulty naming directly.